The story I'm about to tell you happened on a boat, in the dark, off the coast of a small island, at a time nobody expected anything to go wrong. And somewhere, tonight, as you're reading this, it's the exact same kind of night it was back then. Dark. Quiet. And full of things that were never fully explained. This is the story of a woman who was famous before she could even read. A woman who survived a childhood most people wouldn't wish on anyone. A woman who was warned, her entire life, about one specific thing, water, by her own mother, who believed in a prophecy told to her decades earlier on the other side of the world. And on one night in late autumn, 1981, that warning came true. This is the Cold Case Archive. And this is the unsolved story of Natalie Wood. Before we dive into her story, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We cover real unsolved cases every single week, cases most people have forgotten or never fully understood. And if this is your first time here, welcome. You're about to understand why this channel exists. Alright. Let's go back to the beginning. Long before the cameras, before the awards, before her name was known across the world, she was a little girl named Natalia, born in San Francisco on the 20th of July, 1938, to two Russian immigrant parents who had fled a country torn apart by revolution. Her mother, Maria, came from a city called Barnaul, deep in southwestern Siberia. Maria's family had once been wealthy, her father ran soap and candle factories and owned a large estate, but the Russian Civil War destroyed everything they had. The family fled, eventually landing as refugees in a city called Harbin, in northeastern China. And it was there, in Harbin, according to family accounts passed down for generations, that something happened that would shape the rest of Natalie's life before she was even born. Maria and her sisters visited a fortune teller. And that fortune teller made two predictions about Maria's future child. The first, that her second daughter would become a great beauty, known throughout the entire world. The second, a warning. 4 words. Beware of dark water. Maria never let go of either prophecy. Not for the rest of her life. She would go on to marry an American mechanic, and years later, after that marriage ended, she married a man named Nicholas, a Russian immigrant from the far east of the country, a carpenter by trade, and, by most accounts, a man struggling with alcoholism. Their daughter arrived in 1938. And when the family later became American citizens, the name settled into place. The one the world would eventually come to know. Natalie Wood. By the age of 4, she had already appeared on a movie screen. By 8 years old, she'd starred in what would become a beloved holiday classic. And her mother, the same woman haunted by a stranger's prophecy from a decade earlier in China, would spend every single day whispering 2 things into her daughter's ears. In one ear, fame, beauty, the whole world watching. In the other, stay away from dark water. Natalie never learned how to swim. Not as a child. Not as an adult. Not ever. What followed was not a childhood in any traditional sense. It was a career, built almost entirely by her mother's ambition. Biographers who later studied Maria's role in Natalie's rise described a woman who pushed her daughter into the entertainment industry from the earliest possible age, uprooting the entire family, relocating them for opportunities, and controlling every dollar that came through her daughter's growing career. Natalie was tutored on film sets instead of attending school. She was kept away from other children her age. Every hour of her life was structured around a singular purpose, her career, and by extension, her family's survival, because by the time she was still only 8 years old, she had become the primary income earner for her entire household. During the production of a film in 1949, when Natalie was just 10 years old, a stunt went wrong. A scene called for a bridge to collapse the moment she reached safety, but the timing failed. She was only halfway across when it gave way, and she fell, snapping her wrist and landing in the water below. According to her younger sister, their mother didn't trust doctors or hospitals. The injury was never properly treated. The bone healed incorrectly, and for the rest of her life, Natalie wore bracelets to hide the visible deformity in her wrist. It became, in many ways, a pattern that would define her entire young life: hide the pain, protect the image, and say nothing. By her mid-teens, Natalie Wood was one of the most recognizable young actresses in the country. And with that fame came relationships and pressures that, by any modern standard, should never have existed for someone her age. Biographers have since documented deeply troubling accounts from this period of her life, allegations involving adults in positions of power who took advantage of her youth and her mother's ambition. These accounts have been the subject of extensive investigation by journalists and authors in the decades since, and they paint a picture of an industry, and in some cases a family, that failed to protect a child who was never really allowed to be one. By the time Natalie was a teenager, she had already secured the role that would change the trajectory of her career forever, a 1955 film about disaffected youth that would go on to become a cultural landmark. She'd earned her first Academy Award nomination for it before she was even old enough to vote. 2 more nominations would follow over the coming years. She'd go on to star in some of the most enduring films of the era, stories about love, identity, and young women trying to carve out lives of their own in a world that wanted to define them. It's easy to see, looking back, why so much of her work resonated. She wasn't just performing those roles. In many ways, she was living a version of them. By her 20s, Natalie Wood wasn't just a successful actress. She was one of the biggest stars in the world. And her personal life would prove just as public as her career, most notably, her relationship with actor Robert Wagner, whom she married in 1957, divorced in 1962, and then, remarkably, remarried in 1972 after both had gone on to other marriages and families of their own. By the early 1980s, Natalie Wood was in her 40s, a mother of 2, and preparing to make a comeback into film after focusing more on television work in the years prior. She had a new project lined up, a science fiction film called Brainstorm, co-starring a young actor fresh off winning an Academy Award for his role in a war drama that had shaken audiences just a few years earlier. His name was Christopher Walken. None of them, not Natalie, not Robert, not Christopher, could have known that a weekend boat trip that November would become the single most examined, most debated, most unresolved chapter of her entire life. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment below with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this story all the way through, because what happened next has been picked apart by investigators, journalists, and true crime audiences for over 4 decades, and we still don't have a full answer. It was the last weekend of November, 1981. Thanksgiving had just passed. Natalie Wood, her husband Robert Wagner, her Brainstorm co-star Christopher Walken, and the yacht's young captain, a man named Dennis Davern, set out from Marina del Rey aboard the family's 58-foot motor yacht, named Splendour, headed toward Santa Catalina Island, off the coast of Southern California. By most accounts, the trip started off fine. But tension began building almost immediately. According to Davern, who would go on to give multiple accounts of that weekend over the following decades, Robert Wagner grew visibly uneasy about the attention his wife was paying to her younger co-star. There were rumors, even before the trip, of a possible attraction between Natalie and Christopher. Whether or not those rumors held any truth has never been confirmed. But the tension on that boat, according to nearly every account given since, was real, and it grew heavier with every passing hour. On the Friday, the group went ashore to the small harbor town of Avalon and spent much of the evening drinking. By Saturday, the 28th of November, the mood on the boat had shifted from tense to volatile. That night, sometime around 10:30 in the evening, the 4 of them gathered in the yacht's salon, the main living area below deck. Natalie had already changed into her flannel nightgown. According to Davern's later testimony, the kettle was on for tea. Candles were lit. A bottle of wine was open. And for a moment, things seemed calm. Natalie and Christopher were talking, laughing. And then, according to Davern, Robert Wagner picked up the wine bottle and smashed it down onto the table. What followed, by every account given since, was an argument. Natalie reportedly left the salon. Robert followed her. 2 independent witnesses, people on a nearby boat that night, would later tell investigators they heard a man and a woman arguing on the back of the Splendour. They recognized the voices. They said it was Robert Wagner and Natalie Wood. And then, according to those same witnesses, the argument simply stopped. No shouting. No splash. No cry for help. Just silence, swallowed by the sound of a rough, cold sea on a moonless November night. But that silence, as it turns out, was not complete. A woman named Marilyn Wayne, anchored in a separate boat roughly 80 feet away, later told investigators that she and her boyfriend heard something entirely different. Around 11 o'clock that night, they heard a woman's voice screaming from somewhere out on the water. Words that, to this day, are difficult to hear repeated out loud. "Somebody please help me. I'm drowning." The cries reportedly continued for roughly 30 minutes. Wayne and her boyfriend tried calling the harbor master. Nobody answered. There was a party happening on another nearby boat that night, and the couple ultimately assumed what they were hearing might simply be partygoers joking around out on the water. They didn't call again. Back on the Splendour, Robert Wagner would later state that he assumed his wife had gone to bed. It wasn't until some time later that he noticed she wasn't in the cabin, and that the yacht's small dinghy, named Prince Valiant, was also missing. He did not call for help until 1:30 in the morning. By 8 o'clock the next day, the 29th of November, 1981, Natalie Wood's body was discovered floating in the water, roughly a mile away from where the Splendour remained anchored. She was still wearing her nightgown, a down jacket, and wool socks. The small dinghy was found beached nearby. She was 43 years old. The following day, on the 30th of November, the chief medical examiner for the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office announced his determination. Accidental drowning. Investigators at the time pointed to bruising on her body, which they described as consistent with a fall into the water, along with scratch marks discovered on the surface of the dinghy, marks they believed suggested Natalie had attempted, unsuccessfully, to climb back aboard before succumbing to exhaustion in the cold, rough sea. 2 days later, Hollywood gathered for a funeral. Robert Wagner was seen kissing her coffin. The investigation was formally closed less than 2 weeks after her death. For over a decade, that was the official story. A tragic accident. A woman, afraid of the water her entire life, who somehow ended up in it, alone, in the dark, with no one aboard the boat realizing she was even missing until it was far too late. But even at the time, there were people who couldn't make the pieces fit. The medical examiner who originally ruled the death an accident later admitted, in a book he published 2 years afterward, that he was troubled by unanswered questions. Why would a woman who was famously, deeply afraid of dark water walk out to the stern of a yacht, alone, in the middle of a cold November night, and untie a small dinghy? Where was she even going? And why did it take so long for anyone aboard the boat to realize she was gone? Natalie's own sister, in a memoir published a few years after her death, raised the exact same doubts. She simply could not accept that her sister, who avoided water her entire life, who never even learned to swim, would have willingly ventured out onto open water alone in those conditions. But without new evidence, without anyone coming forward, the case remained closed. For nearly 30 years. That changed in 2009, when Dennis Davern, the yacht's captain, published a book detailing his account of that final night, an account that, notably, differed in key ways from what he had originally told investigators back in 1981. Davern became one of over 700 people who signed a public petition criticizing the original investigation into Natalie Wood's death. And in November of 2011, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department made an announcement that reignited public interest in the case for the first time in decades. They were reopening it. The following year, in 2012, the Los Angeles County Coroner formally changed the official cause of death. No longer simply an accident. The new ruling, drowning, and other undetermined factors. Investigators cited a closer re-examination of the bruising on her body, which they said was now consistent with a physical struggle, not just an accidental fall. Then, in February of 2018, the case took its most significant turn yet. The Sheriff's Department reclassified Natalie Wood's death as suspicious, and for the first time, formally named a person of interest in their ongoing investigation. That person was her husband, Robert Wagner. It's important to understand exactly what that designation means, and what it does not mean. A person of interest is not a suspect. It is not an accusation of guilt. It means, in the language of investigators, that a person may have information relevant to a case, or that their proximity to the events in question warrants further scrutiny. Robert Wagner has never been charged with any crime in connection with his wife's death. He has consistently, publicly maintained that it was a tragic accident, that Natalie must have slipped into the water unnoticed while he was unaware. By this point, Wagner was in his 90s, and by most reports, no longer willing to speak further with investigators. Two witnesses, separately, also came forward during the renewed investigation. Both told detectives they had heard the argument aboard the Splendour that night, the same argument Dennis Davern had described. Lead investigators on the case would later describe these witnesses as highly credible, stating that their accounts lined up closely with what Davern had already told them. As for the woman who heard the screams that night in 1981, the one who told the public, in the months following Natalie's death, that she'd heard a woman crying out for help on the water, investigators would later say they came to believe she may have simply been mistaken about what she heard. By 2022, the Sheriff's Department indicated that all existing leads had effectively been exhausted. The case remains, technically, open, but has moved into what investigators describe as cold case status. Should new, credible information ever surface, the file remains available for further investigation. No arrests. No charges. No trial. Just an official record that has shifted, again and again, over more than 4 decades, from accident, to undetermined, to suspicious, without ever reaching a final resolution. Even now, the unanswered questions from that night are the same ones that have haunted investigators, journalists, and Natalie's own family for over 40 years. Why would a woman with a lifelong, well-documented fear of dark water go out onto the swim step, or into a small dinghy, alone, on a cold and rough November night? Could the bruising on her body have occurred before she ever entered the water? What actually happened during the final argument aboard that boat, the one two separate witnesses say they heard, the one that ended not with a splash, but with silence? And why did it take over 2 hours, from the moment the screams were reportedly heard on the water, to the moment anyone called for help? Natalie's family remains divided to this day. Her younger sister has been the most vocal, publicly stating in interviews that she believes Robert Wagner was responsible for her sister's death. Natalie's daughter, meanwhile, has taken the opposite position entirely, publicly defending Wagner as a loving father figure in the decades since, and rejecting the idea that he had any role in her mother's death. Robert Wagner has never been convicted of any crime. Under the law, and under basic principles of fairness, he remains, and should be treated as, innocent of any wrongdoing unless proven otherwise in a court of law. What we do know, from the official record, is this: the story investigators were originally told back in 1981 has changed over time. The physical evidence has been re-examined. New witnesses have come forward. And the case, once closed, was reopened, and remains open today. Somewhere between the official record, the shifting testimony, and the 4 decades of unanswered questions, lies the truth of what actually happened aboard the Splendour on that cold November night. We may never know it in full. So, where do you land on this one? Do you believe it was a tragic accident, exactly as it was first ruled back in 1981? Or do you think there's more to that night that has never come to light? Drop your theory in the comments below. I read every single one, and on a case like this, the discussion is honestly half the reason I make these videos. If this is your first time here, this is the Cold Case Archive, and we cover real, documented unsolved cases every single week, cases that deserve to be remembered, and questions that deserve to keep being asked. If you want to see more cases like this one, hit that subscribe button, drop a like on this video, and let me know in the comments which case you want us to dig into next. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. Stay curious. And I'll see you in the next one.